Shalom again. Shabbat shalom. I'm going to do the sermon, Aaron, anyway. But for sure yours takes number one, and mine'll, if it's lucky, come in number two. We'll see. You'll let me know afterwards. So, friends, there is a really noteworthy and surprising detail in this week's Torah portion that offers, I think at least, one of the most profound and critically important moral teachings in all of Torah. But it happens so quickly that if you didn't know what to look for, you would almost certainly miss it. Our ancestors return from successfully defeating one of their most significant adversaries, the Midianites. And surprisingly, Moses greets them not with joy and pride in the success of their campaign, but rather with incredible disappointment. The Torah records a simple two-word statement, Vayiktsov Moshe. Moses became angry. And it goes on to describe Moses' furious rebuke of the officers for not carrying out the battle with sufficient severity. He demands they return to the battlefield and then starts to instruct them on the laws of ritual purification they must observe when they come back from war. None of that is actually surprising. That Moses gets angry isn't all that curious. He's been growing increasingly frustrated with the people for 40 years. Nor is it surprising that Moses would instruct the soldiers in matters of war or in matters of ritual purity. That's precisely what Moses has done throughout the wilderness. God's entrusted him to teach the rules, to teach Torah. But here is the surprising part. Moses gets the law he teaches wrong. And without any fanfare, without any criticism, without even telling us Moses made a mistake, the Torah offers a correction and simply has Eleazar, the priest, step in and immediately teach the soldiers the correct laws of purification. It's subtle, almost imperceptible, but the implication of it is pretty stunning. Why would Moses, who knows these laws better than anyone else, who has spent 40 years teaching them, suddenly forget them? Rashi notices what most readers would never see. He explains that Moses' anger clouded his memory. The law escaped him. A midrash in Numbers Rabbah offers an extraordinary summary of what has happened. It teaches, whoever becomes angry, if they are wise, their wisdom departs from them. Notice what that does not say. It doesn't teach that anger first makes us immoral. It doesn't say anger first makes us cruel. It says that the first casualty of anger is our knowledge. That's a much deeper claim than the one our society typically makes about anger. And perhaps there is even a deeper clue hidden in the Torah's language itself. The Torah doesn't simply say Moses became angry. It uses this very unusual verb, vayiktsov. That root of that word is ketzef, and it literally means foaming or frothing. The froth that churns on the surface of a turbulent water. Think about that extraordinary image. The problem isn't simply that anger burns. The problem is that anger froths. It churns the surface until you can no longer see clearly beneath it. The water is still there. The truth is still there. The humanity of another person is still there, but you can't see it. Your vision is obscured by the froth. And that's exactly what anger does. Before it destroys relationships or communities or nations, it clouds our vision. It froths our perception until we stop seeing clearly. We stop seeing complexity. We stop seeing nuance. We stop seeing another human being as B'Tselem Elohim. We stop seeing the image of God in them. Instead, we think we see very clearly, but all we see is the offense, the enemy, or the caricature our anger has created. And once we stop seeing clearly, that's when we start to forget. We forget facts. We forget perspective. We forget compassion. We forget what we already knew. Even Moses. The first thing anger destroys is memory. And the Talmud tells us why this is a problem we should be worried about. Here are its words. Anyone who rips his clothes in anger, that same anger vayiktsov, or breaks vessels in anger, or throws their money in the air in anger, you should regard them as if they had committed idolatry. For this is the practice of the evil inclination. Today it tells someone to go and do this, and tomorrow it says go and do that, until one day it says go and worship idols. And then that person goes and worships idols. The rabbis aren't saying that anger equals idol worship, but they are saying that this is how idolatry works. One step, then another, until eventually something entirely different is governing our lives. Idolatry isn't just about our ancients worshiping statues. Idolatry ultimately is about what or whom we allow to shape our choices and govern our behaviors. Anger may begin as an emotion, but it eventually becomes an authority and something we obey. And that is idolatry. And that, I would argue, is exactly what is at work in the world we live in today. Just yesterday, I was listening to an interview with David Brooks from speaking at the Aspen Ideas Festival about the state of our country. Did anyone hear his interview? He made an observation that immediately reminded me of this Torah portion. He said, quote, "America doesn't have an anger problem. America has a contempt problem." I think Brooks is giving contemporary language to what the Torah understood thousands of years ago. Anger may be the spark, but contempt is what happens when the froth never settles. Brooks goes on to explain that anger at least still assumes a relationship. We argue because we care. We still recognize the other person as someone worth engaging at least. But contempt is different. Contempt says, you're beneath me. You aren't worth hearing. You aren't worth understanding. And once we've arrived there, we're no longer seeing another human being. We're only seeing an obstacle, an opponent, an enemy. Which is why Brooks goes on to say the goal isn't to disagree less, but to disagree better. Judaism doesn't have a problem with disagreement. It's actually built on sacred argument. What Judaism fears is contempt, because disagreement can strengthen a community, but contempt annihilates communities. And perhaps that's why this Torah portion is always read as we enter the period of time called the 3 weeks, where we find ourselves right now. The 3-week period of time from when the walls of Jerusalem were breached on the 17th of Tammuz to the destruction of the temple on Tisha B'Av, the 9th of Av. Perhaps the rabbis didn't place this reading here because they wanted us to think about destruction, which is always where our minds immediately go to, the destruction of the temple. If that were the goal, they could have simply begun our mourning on Tisha B'Av, but they didn't. They gave us this buildup of 3 weeks. I'd like to think that's because they wanted us to think about what happens and the danger of what happens before destruction. Consider what the temple actually represented. The great Talmudist, the Maharal of Prague, repeatedly teaches that the temple wasn't simply the place where God lived. The temple was the physical embodiment of the unity of the Jewish people. God's presence could only dwell there when that unity existed, when it could be manifested, which means that Rome may have destroyed the physical structure of the building, but spiritually speaking, the temple had already begun disappearing long before its first stone fell, when the people could no longer live together. Most of us know the rabbinic teaching that when the second temple was destroyed, it was because of sinat chinam, baseless hatred. But the Maharal goes deeper, and he offers a different diagnosis. He says sinat chinam was not the disease. It was just the symptom. The disease was the kind of anger that had hardened into contempt, expressed through humiliation, revenge, division, and the inability to recognize one another's humanity. Those destroy the very conditions necessary for God's presence. Sit with that just for a moment. It means that God doesn't leave because people become angry. God leaves because anger clouds our vision until unity becomes impossible. Once we no longer recognize the image of God in another, the place where God's presence once dwelled has already begun to disappear. And maybe that's why the Torah preserves this story about Moses and not a different character from the Bible. Not to embarrass the greatest prophet who ever lived, but to warn us. Even Moses forgot. Not because he lacked wisdom, not because he lacked faith, but because anger clouded his vision. And once his vision was obscured, he forgot. His memory followed. During these 3 weeks, we remember destroyed walls, cities, temples. But there is a deeper remembering. What had the people forgotten before the walls ever fell? It's no different from what anger makes us forget today. The humanity of another, the image of God within them, our shared destiny, our shared covenant, the possibility that another person may hold a truth that I do not. Because if anger first froths the waters of our vision, memories never far behind, and we forget what we once knew to be true. And if anger has the power to obscure wisdom, fracture relationships, destroy unity, and even unravel the conditions necessary for God's presence, then the sacred work of these 3 weeks is to let that froth settle in us, to let the waters of our hearts become still again, still enough to see the waters clearly, to see one another clearly, still enough to remember each other, still enough to remember God, and still enough to begin the holy work of rebuilding, which is available for us any moment we decide to take it up again. Shabbat Shalom.